It was a dreary, rainy afternoon in the bustling city. Henry Carter, the newly elected senator, decided to take a walk to clear his mind after a grueling day filled with meetings and phone calls. Known for his tireless fight for equality and justice, Henry often chose to be among the people he represented, believing that the best way to understand their struggles was to live them himself. Today, he had traded his usual suit and tie for a pair of worn jeans, a plain black hoodie, and sneakers. He looked like any other middle-aged man trying to blend in, and that was exactly how he liked it. As Henry strolled through the wet streets, feeling the raindrops fall on his face, he noticed the people around him. Shoppers rushing to get out of the rain, children splashing in puddles, street vendors trying to protect their merchandise. He loved moments like this, where life just happened without fanfare or pretense. It reminded him of why he fought so hard during his campaign, why he pushed for justice for everyone regardless of their status or wealth. He stopped at a small kiosk to buy a newspaper, enjoying the normalcy of the situation. Meanwhile, Officer Mary Adams was patrolling her assigned area. Mary had been a police officer for over 10 years, and she took her job seriously. The neighborhood she was in had recently seen a rise in petty crimes, and she was determined to make a difference. The rain and the gloomy atmosphere did nothing to lighten her mood, especially after a stressful morning dealing with reports of vandalism and shoplifting. She felt the pressure of being a police officer, the constant demand to maintain order and protect the community. It was during her patrol that Mary spotted Henry. To her, he seemed suspicious, a man in a hoodie loitering near a kiosk with his hands in his pockets. The recent reports of theft in the area made her hyper-aware of anything that seemed out of place. She saw him exchange cash with the vendor, and something about his demeanor, perhaps his casualness, triggered her suspicion. Without hesitation, she decided to approach. "Hey, you there," Mary called out, her voice stern and commanding. Henry looked up, surprised by the sudden attention. He saw Mary walking briskly toward him, her expression serious. For a moment, he thought she might be coming to ask for directions, or perhaps just making a routine check, but the look in her eyes told him otherwise. She was not approaching him as a friendly officer. She was on high alert. "Is there a problem, officer?" Henry asked calmly, trying to gauge the situation. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her hand rested near her utility belt, ready to act if needed. Mary sized him up, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "We've had some trouble in this area lately," she said, her tone almost accusatory. "What are you doing here?" Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, clearly making judgments based on his appearance. Henry, taken aback, tried to stay composed. "I'm just buying a newspaper," he replied, lifting the rolled-up paper in his hand as if to prove his innocence. Mary, however, was not convinced. She had seen too many people lie to her face, and to her, he was just another potential troublemaker. His calmness only made her more suspicious, as if he was too comfortable, too sure of himself. "Hands where I can see them," she ordered. Henry hesitated for a moment, surprised by how quickly the situation was escalating. He knew that refusing could make things worse, so he slowly raised his hands, trying to diffuse the tension. People around them began to take notice, a few stopping to watch. Some even pulled out their phones, recording what they assumed was another routine police intervention. Henry could feel their eyes on him, the judgment, the whispers. He felt a pang of frustration. Here he was, a senator who had fought for justice, now being treated as a criminal simply because of his casual appearance. "Look, officer, I assure you, this is a misunderstanding," Henry said, trying to explain. But Mary was not interested in explanations. She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his, her stance rigid. "I've heard that one before," she muttered, dismissing his words entirely. She reached for his arm, gripping it firmly as she began to lead him away from the kiosk. "Hey, what are you doing?" Henry protested, wincing slightly at the force of her grip. He wasn't used to being manhandled, especially not in public. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd growing louder, the flashes of cameras capturing the moment. He knew that if this continued, it would become a spectacle, something that could easily spiral out of control. Mary, however, seemed oblivious to the attention. She was focused on getting into the patrol car, determined to question him further at the station. "You're coming with me," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Henry sighed, realizing that there was no reasoning with her in that moment. He decided to comply, hoping that once they reached the station, he could clear up the misunderstanding. As they walked, Henry couldn't help but feel a deep sense of irony. He had campaigned against exactly this type of behavior, the abuse of authority, the profiling based on appearance, the lack of empathy. And now, here he was, experiencing it firsthand. He wondered how many others had gone through similar situations. How many people had been judged unfairly simply because they didn't fit a certain image. The patrol car was parked a few blocks away, and the walk felt longer than it should have. The rain continued to fall, soaking Henry's clothes, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, thinking about what would happen next, how he would handle the situation once they arrived at the station. He glanced at Mary, seeing the determination in her eyes. She truly believed she was doing the right thing, and in a way, Henry almost felt sorry for her. She had no idea who he was, no idea the mistake she was making. By the time they reached the car, a small crowd had gathered, some curious, others simply wanting to escape the rain under nearby awnings. Henry could hear snippets of conversation. People wondering what he had done, others criticizing the police for being too harsh. He stayed silent, not wanting to make things worse. Mary opened the car door and gestured for him to get in. "Watch your head," she said, her tone still cold. Henry complied, sliding into the back seat. As the door closed behind him, he took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew that soon enough, the truth would come out, and when it did, it wouldn't be him facing the consequences. He just hoped that Mary would learn something from this, that she would understand the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of how they looked. As Mary got into the driver's seat and started the engine, Henry looked out the window, watching the city pass by. He couldn't help but think about the people who had seen the incident, the videos that were likely already being shared online. This wasn't just about him. It was about the message this kind of behavior sent to the public. He had fought too hard for justice to let something like this slide. One way or another, there would be a lesson learned today for both of them. The patrol car made its way through the rain-slicked streets, the sound of droplets hitting the roof mixing with the distant hum of the city. Henry sat in the back, watching the world pass by through the wet window, his mind racing with a mix of frustration and disbelief. He knew that what was happening wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of the very issues he had dedicated his career to addressing. As a senator, he had always fought for justice, fairness, and equality, but now he was experiencing firsthand the very prejudice he had vowed to fight against. Officer Mary Adams drove with her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her grip on the wheel tight. She was determined to do her duty, unaware of the gravity of her actions. To her, Henry was just another suspicious individual trying to talk his way out of trouble. She couldn't afford to take chances, especially in an area that had been plagued by a recent string of petty crimes. As far as she was concerned, she was doing her job, and she intended to do it well. The car pulled up to the police station, a modest brick building with a faded sign that read Precinct 12. Mary parked in one of the designated spots, her expression still stern as she got out of the car. She walked around to the back and opened the door for Henry, gesturing for him to step out. "Let's go," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Henry complied, stepping out of the car and feeling the cool air hit his face. He was wet, tired, and frustrated, but he knew that soon enough, the truth would come to light. As they entered the station, the noise of phones ringing, officers talking, and the occasional radio chatter filled the air. Mary led Henry through the main area, past desks cluttered with paperwork and bulletin boards covered in wanted posters. Some officers looked up as they passed, curiosity in their eyes. Henry kept his head held high, refusing to let the situation diminish his dignity. He knew that many of these officers would soon recognize who he was, and he could only hope that their reactions would prompt Mary to reconsider her actions. Mary brought Henry to a small, windowless interrogation room, the kind with a metal table and a couple of uncomfortable chairs. She gestured for him to sit down. "Wait here," she said curtly, before stepping out and closing the door behind her. Henry sat down, sighing as he looked around the room. It was cold, impersonal, and reminded him of the many times he had visited similar places, not as a suspect, but as an advocate for those who had been wronged by the system. Meanwhile, outside the room, Mary approached her superior, Sergeant David Thompson, who was standing by his desk, flipping through some paperwork. David was a seasoned officer, someone who had seen his fair share of difficult situations and knew the importance of careful judgment. Mary cleared her throat to get his attention. "Sergeant, I brought in a suspect. He was acting suspicious near a kiosk downtown, and I thought it would be best to bring him in for questioning," she explained, her tone still confident in her actions. David looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Suspicious, you say?" he asked, a note of skepticism in his voice. He had known Mary for years and trusted her instincts, but he also knew that sometimes instincts could be clouded by biases. "Who is he?" David asked, curious about the man she had brought in. Mary handed over Henry's ID, which she had taken during the initial confrontation. David took it, his eyes widening slightly as he read the name. "Mary, are you sure about this?" David asked, his tone shifting. "Do you know who this man is?" Mary frowned, confused by his reaction. "No, sir. He didn't give me much information, just tried to say it was a misunderstanding," she replied. David handed the ID back to her, his expression serious. "This man is Senator Henry Carter. He was just elected. He's not someone you bring in without a very good reason." Mary felt her stomach drop. The confidence she had felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold sense of dread. "A senator?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. David nodded, his gaze stern. "Yes, and he's known for fighting against exactly the kind of profiling you just did. You need to fix this, and fast." Mary swallowed hard, the realization of what she had done hitting her like a ton of bricks. She had not only made a mistake, but she had also potentially jeopardized her career by humiliating a public figure who had done nothing wrong. David walked past her, heading toward the interrogation room. Mary followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a mix of fear and embarrassment, knowing that she would have to face Henry again, this time with the knowledge of who he really was. David opened the door to the room, stepping inside with Mary close behind. Henry looked up as they entered, his expression calm, but his eyes betraying a hint of frustration. "Senator Carter," David began, his voice respectful, "I'm Sergeant David Thompson. I want to apologize on behalf of the precinct for this misunderstanding." Mary stood beside him, her eyes downcast, unable to meet Henry's gaze. Henry took a deep breath, nodding slightly. "I appreciate that, Sergeant. I understand that mistakes happen, but this is exactly what I've been fighting against," he said, his voice measured but firm. David nodded, glancing at Mary before turning back to Henry. "You're absolutely right, sir. Officer Adams here will be held accountable for her actions, and we will ensure that something like this doesn't happen again." Henry's eyes shifted to Mary, who finally looked up, her face flushed with shame. I'm truly sorry, Senator," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I misjudged the situation, and I let my assumptions get the best of me." Henry studied her for a moment before speaking. "Officer Adams, I appreciate your apology. I know your job isn't easy, and I understand the pressures that come with it. But you need to remember that every person you encounter deserves respect, regardless of how they look or what you think they might be up to. That's the kind of change I'm trying to bring to our system." Mary nodded, his words cutting deep. She had always prided herself on being a good officer, someone who served her community with integrity. But now, she realized that she had let her biases cloud her judgment, and it had led to a mistake that could have serious consequences. David cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Senator Carter, If there's anything we can do to make this right, please let us know, he said. Henry stood up, his posture tall and composed. I don't want special treatment, Sergeant. I just want to see change. I want officers to treat everyone with the same respect and dignity, regardless of who they are. If this incident can serve as a learning experience, then at least some good can come of it. He turned to Mary, his gaze softening slightly. I hope you take this as an opportunity to grow, Officer Adams. We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn from them that defines us. Mary felt a lump in her throat as she nodded. I will, sir. Thank you for your understanding. David stepped aside, allowing Henry to leave the room. As Henry walked out of the station, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He was relieved that the situation hadn't escalated further, but he was also deeply aware of how easily things could have gone wrong. He had seen the looks on the faces of the people who had watched his arrest, the assumptions they had made without knowing the full story. It was a stark reminder of why his work was so important. As he stepped back into the rainy afternoon, Henry took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He knew that this wasn't the end of the matter. It was just the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, so many minds to change, and so many lives to impact. And as he walked away from the station, he couldn't help but hope that Mary Adams would be one of those who would learn, grow, and become part of the solution rather than the problem. The door to the interrogation room closed softly behind Sergeant David Thompson as he left Henry Carter to his thoughts. The senator leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to collect himself. The sterile, windowless room with its cold metal table was far from a place he expected to find himself. Just a few hours ago, he had been in his office, surrounded by colleagues discussing upcoming legislation. And now he was sitting in an interrogation room like a common criminal. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him, but neither was the importance of what had just transpired. Meanwhile, Officer Mary Adams stood outside the room, her thoughts in turmoil. She had just learned that she had humiliated a senator, a man who had dedicated his life to fighting for people's rights. The embarrassment was overwhelming, but there was also a deep sense of regret gnawing at her. How had she allowed herself to get to this point? How had she become so cynical and reactive that she could treat an innocent man with such disdain, especially someone like Henry Carter? David turned to Mary, his eyes showing a mix of concern and disappointment. Mary, you need to understand how serious this is. This isn't just about arresting the wrong guy. You profiled a man who's known for standing up against exactly this kind of behavior, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Mary nodded, her throat dry. She knew there was nothing she could say to undo what had happened, and no excuse that would make it right. Sergeant, Mary began, but her voice trailed off. What could she say that would justify her actions? She had let her assumptions cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the price. David sighed, placing a hand on her shoulder. Look, Mary, we all make mistakes, but it's important to learn from them. You need to face this head-on and do better. You owe it to yourself, to the community, and to Senator Carter. Mary swallowed hard, nodding. She knew David was right. She had always taken pride in being a fair and just officer, but today she had failed. She had failed not only herself, but also the community she had sworn to protect. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. There was no way to change what had happened, but maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to make amends. David gave her a nod before turning away, heading back to his office to handle the fallout from the incident. Mary, left standing in the hallway, knew she needed to confront Henry again, but this time not as an officer in authority, but as a human being seeking to make things right. She walked back to the door of the interrogation room, her hand hovering over the handle for a moment before she finally pushed it open. Henry looked up as the door opened, his expression unreadable. Mary stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. She stood there for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. How could she express the depth of her regret? How could she make him understand that this wasn't who she wanted to be? Senator Carter, she began, her voice softer than before. I wanted to come back and apologize again. I know that what I did was wrong, and I understand that words may not be enough, but I truly am sorry for the way I treated you." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I failed in my duty to serve the community with respect and fairness." Henry studied her for a moment, his gaze steady. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the vulnerability in her posture. It was clear that Mary was genuinely remorseful, and as much as he had every right to be angry, he knew that holding on to that anger wouldn't lead to any positive change. He sighed, leaning forward slightly. "Officer Adams," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I appreciate you coming back to apologize. I understand that being a police officer is not an easy job. You deal with a lot of pressure, and you're expected to make split-second decisions. But what happened today is something that goes beyond a simple mistake. It's about the culture within our system, a culture that allows people to be judged based on appearances rather than facts." Mary nodded, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She knew he was right. She had fallen into the very trap that she had always tried to avoid, judging someone without truly understanding their circumstances. "You're absolutely right, Senator," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't change what I did, but I want you to know that I will do everything I can to be better. I don't want to be the kind of officer who makes people feel unsafe. I want to be someone who protects and serves with integrity." Henry gave her a small, encouraging smile. "That's all anyone can ask for, Officer Adams. The important thing is that you recognize your mistake and are willing to learn from it. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this, when we take responsibility for our actions and make a commitment to do better." Mary felt a glimmer of hope at his words. She had expected anger, condemnation, maybe even a demand for her dismissal. But instead, Henry had offered her a chance to learn and grow. It was more than she deserved, and she was determined not to waste the opportunity. "Thank you, Senator," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I promise I won't take this lightly. I will make changes, starting with myself." Henry nodded, standing up from his chair. "I believe you, Officer Adams, and I hope that moving forward, you'll not only change yourself, but also help change the culture within the force. We need more officers who are willing to look beyond stereotypes and see the humanity in every person they encounter." Mary watched as Henry extended his hand toward her. She hesitated for a moment before reaching out and shaking it, feeling a sense of resolve wash over her. This was her chance to be part of something bigger, to be the kind of officer she had always aspired to be but had somehow lost sight of along the way. As Henry left the room, Mary stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. She knew that her journey was just beginning, and it wouldn't be easy. There would be scrutiny, questions, and perhaps even backlash from her peers. But she was ready to face it. She owed it to herself, to the community, and most importantly, to people like Henry who believed in the possibility of change. Henry walked through the precinct, his head held high. Officers watched as he passed by, some murmuring in surprise as they realized who he was. He ignored the stares, focused instead on the path ahead. The incident had given him a new perspective, a renewed determination to address the systemic issues that plague not only law enforcement but society as a whole. He had always known that change was difficult, that it required uncomfortable conversations and a willingness to confront the truth. Today had been one of those moments. When Henry finally stepped out of the precinct and into the rainy afternoon, he felt a sense of closure. The experience had been humiliating, but it had also been enlightening. It had shown him that the fight for justice wasn't just about passing laws or making speeches. It was about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time. He looked back at the building, knowing that somewhere inside, Officer Mary Adams was beginning her own journey of change. It wouldn't be easy for her, but he had faith that she could do it. Henry's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He took it out, seeing a message from one of his aides, asking if he was okay and whether he needed any assistance. Henry typed a quick response, assuring them that everything was under control. As he put his phone away, he began to walk, his mind already thinking of the next steps he needed to take. He knew that this incident would likely make headlines, and he intended to use it as an opportunity to highlight the need for reform within law enforcement. He walked down the street, the rain still falling, but now it felt different. It felt cleansing, almost symbolic of a fresh start, not just for himself, but for Mary, for the precinct, and perhaps even for the community. Change was coming, and Henry Carter was ready to lead the charge, one step at a time. The days following the incident were a whirlwind of media attention, scrutiny, and introspection. News of the senator's wrongful detainment spread quickly, making headlines across the city and even gaining national attention. Senator Henry Carter's calm demeanor during the situation had earned him both sympathy and respect, but it had also cast a glaring spotlight on the flaws within the local police force. The image of a public servant, humiliated because of assumptions based on his appearance, resonated deeply with many citizens. Inside Precinct 12, the atmosphere was tense. Officers who had previously gone about their duties with a sense of normalcy now found themselves caught in the backlash of what had happened. Sergeant David Thompson was working overtime to manage both the internal and external pressure. Meetings were held, discussions took place, and the command staff had to make difficult decisions regarding Officer Mary Adams. For Mary, it was as if the world she knew was unraveling right before her eyes. Mary had been temporarily suspended from duty, pending an internal investigation. It was the first time in her career that she had been taken off the streets, and the feeling was crushing. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed, to follow her instincts and protect the community. But now, every decision she had made in that moment seemed like a glaring mistake. The realization that she had not only detained an innocent man, but had also mistreated a senator who was known for fighting for the underprivileged weighed heavily on her. The media coverage only made things worse. Reports highlighted the irony of the situation, how an officer had humiliated a man who had dedicated his life to promoting equality and justice. Commentators debated the implications of the incident, with some calling for immediate disciplinary action against Mary and others questioning the culture of the police force itself. Mary watched the news coverage from her small apartment, each word a painful reminder of her actions. She felt exposed, judged, and deeply ashamed. Sergeant David Thompson was caught in the middle of it all. He had to deal with public statements, internal reviews, and a growing demand from the community for reform. He had always tried to lead his precinct with integrity, but now it felt like everything was slipping out of his control. The incident involving Henry Carter was not just a simple mistake. It was a reflection of the deep-rooted issues that plagued the system. And David knew that this time, apologies wouldn't be enough. Real action was needed. One afternoon, David sat in his office, reviewing a stack of documents related to Mary's suspension and the internal investigation. He knew Mary well. She wasn't a bad officer, but she had made a critical error. He also knew that she was genuinely remorseful, but her regret alone wouldn't be enough to appease the growing demands for accountability. As he leaned back in his chair, David decided that he needed to speak with Mary face to face, to understand where her mind was at and to see if there was a way forward for her. David called Mary into his office, and she arrived a few minutes later, her expression somber. She entered the room, her eyes downcast, and took a seat across from him. David studied her for a moment before speaking. "Mary, I know this has been a difficult time for you. I want you to know that I don't think you're a bad officer, but we have to address what happened. The community is demanding answers, and we have to show that we're willing to make changes." Mary nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand, Sergeant. I know I made a mistake, a huge mistake, and I'm willing to face the consequences. I want to find a way to make this right somehow." Her eyes met David's, and he could see the pain and regret in them. She was a good person who had made a bad choice, and now she was struggling to figure out how to move forward. David sighed, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his desk. "Mary, the problem isn't just what happened with Senator Carter. The problem is what it represents. There's a culture here, within the precinct, within law enforcement as a whole, that allows this kind of behavior to happen. We've got to do better, all of us, and that includes you. He paused for a moment before continuing. I've been thinking, and I want to offer you a way to move forward, but it's going to take work. Mary looked up, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Sergeant. I want to change. I want to be better. David nodded, appreciating her determination. All right then, here's what I'm thinking. During your suspension, I want you to take part in a community outreach program. You need to be on the ground, talking to the people we serve, understanding their struggles. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to take you out of your comfort zone, but I think it could help you see things from a different perspective. Mary swallowed, the weight of his words sinking in. Community outreach wasn't something she had much experience with, and the thought of facing the very people she had wronged was daunting. But she knew that if she wanted to make amends, this was the path she had to take. She nodded. I understand, Sergeant. I'll do it, whatever it takes to make things right. David gave her a small, encouraging smile. Good. This isn't going to be easy, Mary. There will be people who won't forgive you, who will question your motives, but you have to stay focused. If you want to be part of the solution, you need to show them that you're willing to change, not just with words, but with actions. Mary nodded again, feeling a sense of purpose beginning to form within her. This was her chance to prove that she could be better, that she could learn from her mistakes and be the kind of officer she had always aspired to be. As Mary left David's office, she felt a mixture of fear and determination. The next steps would be challenging, but she was ready to face them. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could work toward a better future, not just for herself, but for the community she served. She needed to confront the biases she held and understand the experiences of those she had sworn to protect. It was a daunting task, but one that she was ready to take on. Henry Carter, meanwhile, was also dealing with the aftermath of the incident. He had received countless messages of support from constituents, colleagues, and even strangers who had seen the news. While he appreciated the outpouring of solidarity, he knew that this was an opportunity to push for meaningful change. He scheduled meetings with local officials, community leaders, and even representatives from the police department. Henry understood that systemic issues required systemic solutions, and he was determined to be a catalyst for that change. A few days later, Henry found himself back at the precinct, not as a suspect, but as an advocate. He had been invited to speak with officers about the importance of empathy and respect in law enforcement. It was an unusual situation, but one that he welcomed. As he stood in front of a room full of officers, including Mary, he spoke from the heart. He shared his experiences, not just from the incident, but from his years of working alongside people from all walks of life. He talked about the importance of seeing the humanity in every person, of understanding that everyone has a story that deserves to be heard. Mary listened intently, her heart heavy but hopeful. Henry's words resonated deeply with her, and she realized that this was her chance to start anew. The journey ahead would be long, but she was ready to take the first steps. As Henry concluded his speech, he looked directly at Mary, giving her a nod of encouragement. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to her. It was a reminder that change was possible, that redemption was within reach if she was willing to put in the work. The chapter closed with a sense of renewed purpose. For Henry, the incident had become a platform for advocacy, a way to push for the reforms he had always believed in. For Mary, it was the beginning of a long road toward redemption, a chance to prove that she could be better, that she could truly serve and protect the community with integrity and compassion. And for the precinct, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that true justice required more than just enforcing the law. It required understanding, empathy, and a commitment to doing better. Mary Adams spent her first week of suspension trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. The precinct had always been a place where she felt strong, competent, and in control. Now, sitting in her small apartment, she felt anything but. The once familiar sight of her uniform hanging in the corner now seemed to taunt her, a reminder of the person she thought she was and the reality of what she had become. The public backlash was intense, and it was hard for her to avoid seeing her name mentioned on the news or social media. She knew she couldn't hide from what she'd done. Her face, Her name and the details of her actions were plastered across every media outlet in the city. The judgment was relentless. People called her biased, reckless, and incompetent. It stung to hear. But deep down, Mary knew they had every right to be angry. She had failed in her duty, not only to Senator Henry Carter, but also to every person she had sworn to protect without prejudice. She had let her own stress, her own fears, and her own biases dictate her actions, and it had led her down a path she never intended to take. Mary had joined the police force 10 years ago with a clear purpose: to protect and serve. She came from a family of public servants, and her father had been an officer for over 20 years. She remembered the stories he used to tell her when she was a child. Stories of bravery, compassion, and, most importantly, justice. He taught her that being a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about being a protector of the people, someone who others could trust in times of need. But somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of those values. The pressures of the job, the long hours, and the countless confrontations with crime had hardened her, and she realized she had become someone her father would never have wanted her to be. One morning, after a restless night, Mary decided she needed to do something rather than just sit in her apartment. She took David's advice to heart and signed up for a community outreach program that worked with underprivileged youth. It was a program designed to build bridges between law enforcement and the community, an attempt to break down the walls of mistrust that had grown over the years. As she walked into the community center for the first time, Mary felt a knot in her stomach. She wasn't sure how she would be received, especially with her recent actions still fresh in people's minds. The center was bustling with activity. Children played in one corner, while volunteers handed out supplies in another. Mary stood by the entrance, feeling like an outsider in her own community. She took a deep breath and approached one of the program coordinators, a middle-aged woman named Carla, who gave her a polite but somewhat wary smile. "You must be Officer Adams," Carla said, extending her hand. Mary shook it, nodding. "Yes, that's me. I'm here to help however I can," Mary replied, her voice filled with a mix of determination and vulnerability. Carla led her to a group of teenagers who were sitting in a circle, engaged in a discussion about their experiences with law enforcement. Mary listened as they spoke openly about their fears, their frustrations, and their anger. They talked about feeling targeted, about not being heard, about officers who treated them like criminals simply because of where they lived or how they looked. Mary felt a pang of guilt as she realized that their words described exactly what she had done to Henry. She had treated him like a suspect without any evidence, purely because of her own assumptions. As the session continued, one of the teenagers, a boy named Jamal, looked directly at Mary. "What about you, Officer Adams? Why do cops always assume the worst about us?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of anger and genuine curiosity. Mary hesitated, feeling the weight of his question. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I don't have a good answer for that, Jamal," she admitted. "What I did was wrong, and I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here because I want to learn, to understand, and to be better. I can't change what I did, but I can work to make sure it doesn't happen again." Jamal studied her for a moment before nodding, seemingly satisfied with her honesty. The group continued their discussion, and Mary found herself listening more than she spoke. It was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. She needed to hear their stories, to understand the impact that actions like hers had on real people. By the end of the day, Mary felt emotionally drained, but for the first time since the incident, she also felt a sense of purpose. This was the beginning of her journey to make amends, not through words but through actions. Meanwhile, Henry Carter was navigating his own challenges. The incident had sparked a wave of public support for his stance on law enforcement reform, but it had also brought with it a host of new pressures. He was receiving invitations to speak at various events, requests for interviews, and even offers to collaborate with civil rights organizations. Henry knew that this was an opportunity to bring about real change, but he also felt the weight of the expectations being placed on him. He couldn't afford to let this moment pass without making an impact. One afternoon, Henry sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of papers and notes from his meetings. His aide, Laura, entered the room, carrying a tablet with the latest headlines. "Senator, you're trending again," she said, her tone a mix of amusement and exhaustion. Henry looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What now?" he asked, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Laura handed him the tablet, showing him an article titled, "Senator Carter Turns Police Misstep into Call for Reform." Henry read the article, nodding slowly. "It's a good headline," he said, setting the tablet down. "But headlines aren't enough, Laura. We need real change, and that means taking action, not just talking about it." Laura nodded in agreement. "You're right. We've got a meeting with the police commissioner tomorrow. It might be a good opportunity to discuss some of the reforms you have in mind." Henry leaned back in his chair, considering her words. He knew that getting the police on board would be crucial, and that meant approaching them not as an adversary, but as a partner in change. The next day, Henry met with Police Commissioner James Anderson, a man known for his no-nonsense approach, but also for his willingness to listen. The two men sat in the commissioner's office, discussing the challenges facing the police force and the community. Henry spoke passionately about the need for better training, for community engagement, and for officers to understand the people they served. Commissioner Anderson listened, his expression serious. "Senator, I understand where you're coming from," Anderson said, his tone measured. "We've got good officers, men and women who put their lives on the line every day. But I also know that we have room for improvement. If we want the community to trust us, we need to earn that trust every day." Henry nodded, appreciating the commissioner's openness. "That's exactly what I want to help with," he replied. "I'm not here to point fingers. I'm here to work with you to make things better, for the officers and for the community." By the end of the meeting, the two men had agreed to work together on a series of initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction. Henry knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to seeing it through, no matter how long it took. As the day ended, Mary found herself back at the community center, this time helping to organize a food drive. She worked alongside volunteers, handing out bags of groceries to families in need. She saw the smiles on their faces, the gratitude in their eyes, and she realized that this was what being a public servant was truly about. Making a difference in people's lives, no matter how small. It wasn't about authority or control. It was about service, compassion, and understanding. That night, as Mary sat on her couch, exhausted but content, she thought about her father and the stories he used to tell. She realized that she had lost her way, but now she had a chance to find her path again. It wouldn't be easy and there would be setbacks, but she was ready to face them. She was ready to be the kind of officer her father would be proud of, a protector, a listener, and above all, a servant of the people. The morning sun broke through the curtains of Henry Carter's office, casting a golden glow over his desk, which was cluttered with papers, reports, and proposals. It had been weeks since the incident with Officer Mary Adams, and since then, Henry had been tirelessly pushing for changes within the local police force. His dedication to equality and justice was unwavering, but he knew that his position alone couldn't bring about the change he envisioned. Real reform required empathy and understanding from both sides, from the community and the police. Henry had spent much of his time meeting with police officials, community leaders, and local organizations to discuss ways to improve relations between law enforcement and citizens. His approach was not about blaming or shaming the police. Instead, it was about finding common ground. He knew that officers like Mary needed support, guidance, and education to do their jobs better. He wanted to foster a culture where police officers could see the people they serve not as potential threats, but as fellow human beings deserving of respect and empathy. One particular morning, Henry received an unexpected call from the community center where Mary had been volunteering. Carla, the program coordinator, invited him to speak at a special event they were organizing, a town hall aimed at bridging the gap between the police and the community. Henry immediately agreed. He knew that this was exactly the kind of opportunity that could help heal the wounds left by the incident, not just for himself but for the community as well. On the day of the event, the community center was packed with people. Some were there out of curiosity, others because they wanted answers. The atmosphere was tense, with a mixture of hope and skepticism lingering in the air. Henry arrived early, greeting people warmly as he made his way to the front of the room. He noticed Mary in the corner, helping to set up chairs. Their eyes met for a moment, and she gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Henry smiled back, appreciating her courage in facing the community. As the event began, Carla introduced Henry to the audience, and he took his place at the podium. He looked out at the crowd, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I know that recent events have brought up a lot of pain, frustration, and questions. I'm not here to pretend that I have all the answers, but I am here to listen and to work with each of you to find solutions. Henry spoke about the importance of empathy, of understanding the struggles that people face every day. He talked about his own experience, how being wrongfully detained by Officer Adams had given him a glimpse into the fear and frustration that so many people feel when dealing with law enforcement. That day, I felt powerless, Henry admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. And I realized that this is how too many people feel when they encounter those who are supposed to protect them. This is not the kind of society we want to live in. We must do better together. He then turned his attention to the police officers present in the room, including Mary. To the officers here today, I want you to know that I don't see you as the enemy. I understand that your job is incredibly difficult, that you face situations most of us can't even imagine. But with that responsibility comes the duty to treat every individual with respect and dignity. We need to rebuild trust, and that starts with empathy, with seeing each other as people, not labels. Mary listened, her eyes fixed on Henry as he spoke. His words resonated with her deeply, and she felt a sense of hope stirring within her. She had spent weeks trying to understand the community better, and now, hearing Henry speak about empathy, she realized just how far-reaching the impact of that one incident had been. It wasn't just about her mistake. It was about the systemic issues that had allowed that mistake to happen in the first place. After Henry finished his speech, Carla opened the floor for questions and comments. A young woman named Sarah stood up, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. Senator Carter, I appreciate what you're doing, but how can we trust that things will actually change? We've heard promises before, and nothing ever really gets better. Her words were met with nods from others in the audience, and the room grew silent as everyone waited for Henry's response. Henry nodded thoughtfully, understanding the skepticism. Sarah, I know that trust is not something that can be rebuilt overnight. It's earned through consistent actions, not just words. I can't promise that everything will change immediately, but I can promise that I will continue to fight for reform, that I will hold myself and others accountable. And I need your help too. Change is a collective effort. It requires all of us to work together, to stay engaged and to hold each other to a higher standard. Sarah sat down, her expression softening slightly, and Henry could see that while she might not be entirely convinced, she was at least willing to give him a chance. That was all he could ask for. As more people spoke, sharing their experiences and concerns, the atmosphere began to shift. The anger and frustration, while still present, were slowly giving way to a sense of possibility, a sense that perhaps change was within reach. Toward the end of the event, Mary stood up, her heart pounding as she addressed the room. I know many of you recognize me, and I want to say that I'm truly sorry for what happened. I made a mistake, and I've been trying to learn from it. Volunteering here, listening to your stories, it's changed me. I know that words aren't enough, but I'm committed to being a better officer and a better member of this community. The room was silent for a moment, and then a few people began to clap. Slowly, the applause spread throughout the room until nearly everyone was clapping. Mary felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption, not just for herself, but for the relationships between the police and the community. Henry watched as Mary spoke, feeling a sense of pride in her courage. He knew that change was never easy, and it often required people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world around them. But seeing Mary stand there, vulnerable and honest, he felt that they were on the right path. This event was just one step, but it was an important one. As the town hall came to a close, people lingered, talking with one another, sharing their thoughts, and, for the first time in a long time, truly listening. Henry and Mary exchanged a look across the room, a silent understanding passing between them. This was just a beginning, but it was a beginning filled with hope and determination, a beginning where empathy and understanding could pave the way for a better future. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of events for both Henry Carter and Mary Adams. The town hall had been a success, but it was just a beginning. Henry knew that in order to make lasting change, he had to keep the momentum going. He continued to work closely with Commissioner Anderson and other leaders in law enforcement to develop policies that would address the issues of racial profiling and community policing. Mary, meanwhile, threw herself into her community work, determined to earn back the trust she had lost and to become the officer she had once aspired to be. One day, Henry received a call from Commissioner Anderson, inviting him to attend a private meeting with a group of officers from Precinct 12. Anderson explained that the officers wanted to share their concerns and perspectives on the proposed reforms. Henry was pleased to hear this. It was a sign that the officers were willing to engage in dialogue rather than resist the changes. He agreed to attend, eager to understand their point of view. The meeting was held in a conference room at the precinct. Henry arrived early, dressed in a simple suit, his demeanor calm and approachable. As he walked through the station, he could feel the eyes of the officers on him. Some were curious, others seemed wary. He knew that not everyone welcomed the changes he was advocating, but he was determined to listen and find common ground. Inside the conference room, a group of about a dozen officers had gathered. Mary was among them, sitting quietly at the end of the table. She had been nervous about the meeting, unsure of how her colleagues would react to Henry's presence. She knew that many of them were skeptical of the reforms and worried that they would make their jobs even harder. But she also knew that this conversation was necessary if they were ever going to move forward. Commissioner Anderson called the meeting to order, introducing Henry to the officers. Henry stood, offering a polite nod to the room. "Thank you all for being here today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you directly," he began, his voice steady. "I know that the changes we're proposing are significant, and I understand that change can be challenging, especially when you're on the front lines, dealing with the realities of law enforcement every day." One of the officers, a man named Officer Johnson, raised his hand. He was a veteran of the force, with over 20 years of experience. "Senator Carter, I've got to be honest with you," Johnson said, his tone respectful but firm. "We're concerned that these reforms are going to tie our hands. We already have a tough job, and it feels like we're being asked to do more with less support." Henry nodded, understanding the officer's concerns. "I hear you, Officer Johnson," he replied. "I know that your job is incredibly difficult, and the last thing I want is to make it harder. But I believe that these changes are necessary because they will help build trust between the police and the community. When people trust you, they're more likely to cooperate, to share information, and to see you as allies rather than adversaries. That trust can make your job safer and more effective in the long run." Another officer, a young woman named Officer Garcia, spoke up. "But how do we build that trust when people already see us as the enemy?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "It feels like no matter what we do, people always assume the worst about us." Henry took a deep breath before responding. "I understand that frustration, Officer Garcia. I know that there are people who have lost faith in law enforcement, and rebuilding that trust won't happen overnight. But it starts with small actions, with showing empathy, with treating every person you encounter with respect. It's about consistency, day in and day out. And it's about acknowledging when mistakes are made and taking steps to make things right. That's how we begin to change perceptions." Mary listened intently, her gaze shifting between Henry and her colleagues. She could see the tension in the room, the mix of emotions on their faces. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others remained skeptical. She knew that many of them felt unappreciated, that their sacrifices often went unnoticed by the public. But she also knew that Henry was right. Trust had to be earned, and it required a willingness to look beyond the badge and see the humanity in every person they served. After a long discussion, Commissioner Anderson spoke up, addressing the room. I know that these conversations aren't easy, but they're necessary if we're going to move forward as a department. We need to be willing to adapt, to learn from our mistakes, and to build stronger relationships with the community. Senator Carter is here because he wants to help us do that, not to undermine us. Henry nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room. I want you all to know that I'm not here to dictate how you do your jobs. I'm here to work with you, to support you, and to help create a system where both officers and citizens feel safe and respected. I know that change is hard, but I truly believe that we can create a better future if we work together. Mary felt a sense of hope as she listened. She could see that some of her colleagues were beginning to soften, their expressions less guarded. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start, and that was enough for her. She raised her hand, her voice steady as she spoke. Senator Carter, I want to thank you for being here today. I know that I've made mistakes, and I'm committed to learning from them. I hope that we can all find a way to move forward together. Henry smiled, appreciating her courage. Thank you, Officer Adams. I believe that real change starts with people like you. People who are willing to learn, to grow, and to make a difference. I'm grateful for your willingness to be part of this journey. As the meeting came to a close, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. It wasn't entirely comfortable, but there was a sense of possibility, a sense that perhaps with time and effort, they could build something better. Henry shook hands with each of the officers as they left, thanking them for their time and their willingness to engage in dialogue. When he reached Mary, he paused, meeting her eyes. You're doing good work, Mary, he said, his voice sincere. Keep it up. Change takes time, but I believe in what you're doing. Mary smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Thank you, Senator. I won't let you down, she replied. As Henry left the precinct, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead was still long, and there would be challenges, setbacks, and resistance. But today had been a step in the right direction. A step toward empathy, understanding, and most importantly, trust. It was a reminder that change wasn't about grand gestures. It was about small, meaningful actions taken consistently over time. Mary watched as Henry left, feeling a sense of resolve settle within her. She knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for it. She was ready to be part of the solution, to work alongside her colleagues and the community to build a better, more just future. And as she looked around the conference room, she could see that others were ready too. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and that was more than enough. Weeks had passed since the meeting at Precinct 12, and Mary Adams found herself in the midst of a transformation. She had thrown herself into her new role in community outreach, spending time with neighborhood leaders, attending local events, and visiting schools. The once distant concept of community policing had become real, personal, and vital to her. She was no longer just a badge. She was a person reaching out to others, learning about their stories and struggles. And, in turn, the community was beginning to see her differently too. One Saturday morning, Mary found herself at a neighborhood park where a community event was being held. The sun shone brightly. Children played on the swings, and the smell of grilled food filled the air. It was the kind of scene that made her feel hopeful, the kind of scene she wanted to protect. She was there as part of an outreach program, an opportunity to meet residents face-to-face, talk with them, and answer their questions about the police department. She wore casual clothes, leaving her uniform behind. Today, she was just Mary, a part of the community. As she walked through the park, she noticed a group of teenagers gathered near a picnic table, talking and laughing. One of them caught her eye, Jamal, the young man she had met at the community center weeks earlier. He looked up and saw her approaching, his smile fading slightly. Mary knew that their first interaction had left an impression, and she hoped that she could show him she was sincere in her efforts to change. "Hey, Jamal," she greeted him, giving him a small wave. He nodded, his expression cautious but curious. "Officer Adams," he replied. Mary smiled. "Actually, today it's just Mary. I'm not here as a cop. I'm here as part of the community." Jamal looked at her for a moment, then gestured for her to sit down at the picnic table. She accepted, sitting across from him and his friends. "So, what brings you here?" Jamal asked, his tone still holding a hint of skepticism. Mary took a deep breath before answering. "I'm here because I want to understand. I know I've made mistakes, and I want to learn how to be better. Not just for myself, but for all of you. I want to be someone who you can trust, who you can come to if you need help. I know it'll take time, but I'm committed to making it happen." One of Jamal's friends, a girl named Tasha, spoke up. "You know, people don't really trust cops around here," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "We've seen too many bad things happen. People getting stopped for no reason, getting treated like they're guilty just because of how they look." Mary nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of their words. "I understand, Tasha, and you're right. There's been a lot of wrong done, and it's going to take more than just words to fix it. But I want you to know that I'm here to listen, to be part of the solution, and to earn that trust back." Jamal leaned back, studying her for a moment. "You're different from when I first met you," he said, his tone softer now. "Back then, it felt like you were just another cop trying to tell us what to do. But now, I don't know. It feels like you're actually trying to understand." Mary smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. "That's because I am. I realize that being a good officer isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about understanding the people you're supposed to serve. And I want to be that kind of officer." The conversation continued, and soon they were talking about more than just policing. They talked about school, their families, their dreams for the future. Mary found herself laughing with them, sharing stories from her own life, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a genuine connection with the people she served. She wasn't just there to make an appearance. She was there to build relationships, to be a part of something bigger. Meanwhile, Henry Carter was continuing his work on reform. He had been collaborating closely with Commissioner Anderson to develop new training programs for officers, programs that focus on empathy, de-escalation, and community engagement. It was a slow process, but Henry was patient. He knew that real change took time, and he was committed to seeing it through. He had also been keeping tabs on Mary's progress, checking in with Carla at the community center, and even speaking with some of the residents who had interacted with her. One afternoon, Henry received a call from Carla, who sounded excited. "Senator Carter, I just wanted to let you know, Mary's really making a difference here. She's been working with the kids, getting involved in the community, and people are starting to notice. It's small steps, but I think it's working." Henry smiled at the news, a sense of pride swelling within him. "That's great to hear, Carla. Thank you for letting me know. I think Mary's journey is just beginning, but it's clear she's headed in the right direction." Henry decided it was time to pay another visit to the community center. He wanted to see for himself the progress that Mary had made, and to show his support for the work she was doing. When he arrived, the center was bustling with activity. Children running around, volunteers handing out supplies, and Mary standing by a table, talking with a group of residents. She looked different, more relaxed, more at ease. She wasn't the tense, defensive officer he had met weeks ago. She was part of the community now. Mary noticed Henry and waved him over, her smile genuine. "Senator Carter." She greeted him warmly. Henry returned the smile. "Mary, it's good to see you. Carla's been telling me about the work you've been doing here. I'm impressed." Mary blushed slightly, looking down for a moment before meeting his gaze. "Thank you, Senator. It's been challenging, but it's also been incredibly rewarding. I feel like I'm finally doing what I set out to do when I became an officer." Henry nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "That's exactly what this is all about, connecting with the people you serve, understanding their needs, and being there for them. I'm proud of you, Mary." This kind of change isn't easy, but you're making it happen one step at a time." Mary felt a swell of emotion at his words. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments when she wondered if she was really making a difference. But hearing Henry's words gave her the reassurance she needed. As the day went on, Henry stayed at the center, talking with residents, listening to their concerns, and offering his support. He could see the difference in the way people interacted with Mary now. There was a level of respect, of trust that hadn't been there before. It was a testament to her hard work, her willingness to change, and her dedication to making things right. Toward the end of the day, Henry and Mary found themselves sitting on a bench outside the community center, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air. "You know, Mary," Henry said, his voice thoughtful, "change is never easy. It requires us to confront our own flaws, to face uncomfortable truths, and to grow. But seeing the work you've done here, I'm reminded that change is possible, that even the smallest actions can have a big impact." Mary looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "Thank you, Senator. I still have a long way to go, but I'm committed to this journey. I want to be the kind of officer who makes a difference, who people can trust, and I want to help others on the force see that too." Henry smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're already making a difference, Mary, and I have no doubt that you'll continue to do so." As the sun set, the two of them sat in silence, watching the sky darken. It was a moment of reflection, of hope for the future, and of understanding that the journey they were on was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, but there would also be more moments like this, moments that reminded them why they fought for change, why they believed in the power of empathy, and why they were committed to building a better future for everyone. It was a crisp autumn morning when Mary Adams walked into Precinct 12, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The air was cool, and the leaves were beginning to turn shades of red and gold. She had been back on the job for several weeks now, but it was different this time. The past few months of community outreach had changed her, reshaped her perspective on what it meant to be an officer. She wasn't just there to enforce the law. She was there to serve the people, to protect them, and to bridge the gap between the police and the community. As she made her way to her desk, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her. Some still looked at her with skepticism, unsure of the new Mary who had emerged from the aftermath of the incident with Senator Henry Carter. But others had begun to see the change. They noticed how she took extra time to talk with residents during her patrols, how she treated everyone she encountered with respect and compassion. It was a gradual shift, but it was one that was impossible to ignore. Sergeant David Thompson watched Mary from across the room, a small smile forming on his lips. He had seen her transformation firsthand, and he was proud of the progress she had made. He knew it hadn't been easy for her, facing the consequences of her actions, earning back the trust of her community, and, perhaps most importantly, regaining her own sense of self-worth. He approached her desk, tapping lightly on the edge to get her attention. "Morning, Mary," he said, his voice warm. "Got a minute?" Mary looked up, nodding. "Sure thing, Sergeant." She followed David into his office, closing the door behind her. David gestured for her to sit, and he took a seat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted to check in with you, see how you're doing," he began. "I know it hasn't been an easy road, but I've been hearing good things from the community, from your colleagues. It seems like you're really making a difference out there." Mary smiled, a mix of pride and humility in her eyes. "Thank you, Sergeant. It's been challenging, but I feel like I'm finally doing what I set out to do when I joined the force. I want to be someone the community can trust, someone they know is here to help them, not to judge them." David nodded, his gaze steady. "That's exactly what we need more of, Mary. Officers who understand that this job is about more than just enforcing the law. It's about empathy, about understanding the people we serve." David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he spoke. "I also wanted to let you know that Senator Carter reached out to me. He's been keeping tabs on your progress, and he's impressed with the work you've been doing. He wants to invite you to join a task force he's putting together. a group focused on improving community relations and developing new training programs for officers. It's a big opportunity, and I think you'd be perfect for it. Mary's eyes widened in surprise, her heart skipping a beat. A task force, she repeated, her voice filled with both excitement and apprehension. I don't know what to say, Sergeant. I mean, I'm honored. But do you really think I'm ready for something like that? David smiled, his eyes filled with encouragement. I know you are, Mary. You've shown a level of dedication and growth that's exactly what this task force needs. You've lived through the challenges, faced your mistakes, and come out stronger on the other side. That's the kind of perspective that can make a real difference. Mary took a deep breath, her mind racing. The idea of working alongside Henry again, of being part of a larger effort to bring about meaningful change, was both thrilling and intimidating. She thought back to the days she had first encountered Henry, the humiliation, the regret, the determination to do better. She had come a long way since then, and this felt like the next step in her journey. All right, she said finally, her voice filled with resolve. I'll do it. I want to be part of the solution, to help make things better for everyone. David nodded, his smile widening. That's what I was hoping to hear. I'll let the senator know, and we'll get the ball rolling. I'm proud of you, Mary. This isn't just about redemption. It's about leadership, and I think you're ready for it. Mary felt a swell of emotion at his words. Leadership. It was a word she hadn't associated with herself in a long time, but now it felt right. She was ready to take on that responsibility, to use her experiences to help others grow. Later that day, Mary received an email from Senator Carter, officially inviting her to join the task force. He wrote about the importance of her perspective, how her journey represented the kind of change they were trying to achieve. He spoke of the challenges ahead, but also of the potential for a real impact. Mary read the email several times, each word reinforcing her decision to move forward. A week later, Mary found herself in a conference room at City Hall, sitting around a table with community leaders, fellow officers, and Senator Henry Carter. The task force meeting was about to begin, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her. Henry stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the group before he spoke. Thank you all for being here today. We're here because we believe in the possibility of change. We believe that we can create a system that serves everyone with fairness, respect, and dignity. He looked directly at Mary, giving her a nod. And we're here because people like Officer Adams have shown us that change is possible. It's not easy. It requires us to confront our own biases, to listen, to learn, and to grow. But it's worth it, because the work we do here can make a real difference in the lives of the people we serve. Mary felt a sense of pride as she listened. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She was ready to be a voice for change, to help shape the future of policing in her community. The meeting began, and as the discussion unfolded, Mary found herself contributing ideas, sharing her experiences, and listening to the perspectives of others. It was a collaborative effort, and for the first time, she truly felt like she was part of something bigger, something meaningful. After the meeting, Henry approached Mary, a smile on his face. You did great today, Mary. I'm really glad you decided to join us. Mary smiled back, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Senator. I'm honored to be here. I want to make a difference, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Henry nodded, his expression sincere. I have no doubt that you will. This is just the beginning, and I'm excited to see where this journey takes us. As Mary left City Hall that day, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in a long time. She had come a long way from the officer who had wrongfully detained an innocent man. She had faced her mistakes, learned from them, and grown. And now, she was using those experiences to help others, to bring about the change that her community so desperately needed. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about purpose, about making a difference, about being part of the solution. The road ahead would still be challenging. There would be setbacks, obstacles, and moments of doubt. But Mary knew that she wasn't alone. She had the support of her colleagues, her community, and leaders like Henry Carter, who believed in her. And most importantly, she believed in herself. She was ready to be the kind of officer she had always aspired to be, a protector, a servant of the people, and a leader for change. Months had passed since Mary Adams joined Senator Henry Carter's task force, and the changes were beginning to take root. The precinct had implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation, empathy, and cultural sensitivity. Officers were being encouraged to engage with their communities, not just through enforcement, but through dialogue and understanding. It wasn't a perfect system. Change never was, but it was a step in the right direction. Mary had become one of the leading voices in these efforts, advocating for an approach that put people first. On a chilly winter morning, Mary was scheduled to speak at a public forum about the progress being made within the police department. She had been nervous about it all week. This was the first time she'd be addressing the public in such a formal setting since the incident that had started her journey of transformation. The forum was held in a large community center, and as Mary arrived, she saw people trickling in, taking their seats. There were community members, local activists, and even a few officers from her precinct. Senator Carter had also arrived early. He greeted Mary warmly, sensing her nervousness. "You're going to do great today, Mary," he reassured her. "Just speak from the heart. People need to hear your story. Your honesty and your willingness to change are what make this work meaningful." Mary nodded, taking a deep breath. She knew Henry was right. This was an opportunity to show people that change was possible, that officers could learn, grow, and truly serve their communities. When the forum began, the atmosphere in the room was one of cautious optimism. People had seen glimpses of progress, but they were still wary. They had heard promises before, and many were waiting to see if this time would be different. Henry spoke first, addressing the audience with his characteristic calm and passion. He talked about the importance of collaboration, of creating a system that worked for everyone, citizens and officers alike. Then he introduced Mary, inviting her to share her journey. Mary stood at the podium, her hands gripping the edges for a moment before she began. "Good morning, everyone. I want to start by saying thank you for being here today, for giving me the chance to speak with you. I know that trust is something that has to be earned, and I also know that I have made mistakes. Mistakes that have hurt people, that have contributed to the very problems we're trying to solve." She paused, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I'm here today because I want to show you that change is possible. I'm not perfect, and I've had to confront some hard truths about myself and about the system I'm a part of. But I believe in the power of empathy, in the power of listening, and in the possibility of building a better future together." She spoke about her time in the community, about the conversations she'd had with residents, and about the lessons she had learned. She talked about Jamal, the young man who had challenged her to see things from a different perspective, and how that conversation had been a turning point for her. "I realized that being an officer isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about being there for people, about understanding their struggles, their fears, and their hopes. It's about seeing the humanity in every person you meet, regardless of their circumstances." The room was silent as Mary spoke, her words resonating with those who listened. She could see the expressions on people's faces, some skeptical, some hopeful, and some visibly moved. She knew that not everyone would be convinced, but she also knew that this was just the beginning. Change took time, and it took effort. It took a willingness to be vulnerable, to admit when you were wrong, and to strive to do better. After Mary finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't unanimous. There were still those who remained wary, but it was enough to show that her words had reached people. Henry stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they returned to their seats. "You did great," he whispered, and Mary smiled, feeling a sense of relief and pride. She had faced her fears, stood in front of the community, and shared her truth. It was a moment of growth, not just for her, but for everyone in the room. After the forum ended, people began to approach Mary, some to thank her, others to share their own stories. One elderly woman, her eyes filled with tears, took Mary's hand. "My grandson was mistreated by the police years ago," she said, her voice trembling. I never thought I'd see the day when an officer would stand up there and say what you just said. Thank you for trying to make things right. Mary felt her throat tighten with emotion, and she squeezed the woman's hand gently. Thank you for being here and for sharing that with me. I promise to keep working to make things better. As the crowd began to disperse, Mary found herself standing with Henry and Commissioner Anderson. The commissioner, who had been a quiet but supportive presence throughout the forum, looked at Mary with a thoughtful expression. I have to say, Mary, I'm impressed. It takes courage to stand up there and admit your mistakes, especially in front of the people who have every right to be angry. But that's what real leadership is about, being honest, being accountable, and striving to be better. Mary nodded, her heart full. Thank you, Commissioner. I've learned a lot over these past few months, and I know there's still so much more to do. But I'm committed to this, to being part of the solution, to helping rebuild trust. Anderson smiled, a rare but genuine expression. And that's exactly what we need. Officers like you are the ones who will help change the culture from within. It won't be easy, but it's worth it. Henry watched the exchange, feeling a sense of hope for the future. He knew that the journey they were on was far from over, but moments like this reminded him why it was worth fighting for. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It was about individuals, about people like Mary who were willing to do the hard work of change one day at a time. As they left the community center, Henry and Mary walked together, the winter air crisp around them. You know, Mary, Henry said, his voice thoughtful, I think what you did today is going to have a ripple effect. People need to see that change is possible, that there are officers who genuinely care about making a difference, and you showed them that today. Mary smiled, her breath visible in the cold air. I hope so, Senator. I know there's still a lot of work to do, but I'm ready for it. I want to be part of the change, to help others see that there's a better way. Henry nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. And you will. One step at a time, we're going to make this happen. They parted ways, Mary heading back to the precinct and Henry to his next meeting. As Mary walked through the doors of Precinct 12, she felt a sense of pride and purpose. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She was no longer the officer who acted out of fear and assumptions. She was someone who had learned, who had grown, and who was committed to serving her community with empathy and integrity. That afternoon, Mary received a call from Carla at the community center. Mary, I just wanted to say thank you, Carla said, her voice filled with emotion. The way you spoke today, it meant a lot to everyone here. It's not every day that people see an officer willing to be vulnerable, to admit their mistakes. You're making a difference. Mary felt her eyes well up with tears. Thank you, Carla. That means the world to me. I'm just trying to do what's right, to be the kind of officer this community deserves. As she hung up the phone, Mary sat at her desk, her heart full. She had come a long way since that fateful day when she had wrongfully detained Henry Carter. She had faced her mistakes, learned from them, and grown. And now, she was using those experiences to help others, to be a voice for change, and to make a real difference in the lives of the people she served. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about purpose, about justice, and about building a future where everyone, regardless of who they were, could feel safe, respected, and heard. And for Mary, that was the greatest reward of all. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care